Hello and welcome to Hazard and Hope. I'm Ed, and in this episode we're going to be looking at how you can find out your flood risk context. This episode of Hazard and Hope is sponsored by Floodline. So first things first, why would you need to know your flood risk context? Well, in the UK, 1 in 4 properties are deemed as being at risk from floods. And as we can see here, the impacts can be devastating. And so developing an understanding of your specific flood risk context is going to be vitally important and help you make those decisions about how best to take action if and when it's needed. Because it could be that there's a variety of different types of flood risk that affect you. Or it might well be that you're new to the area and perhaps not familiar with the terrain or the hydrology. But as a result of climate change, we're also seeing that in many places, the level of flood risk is increasing over time. So your property may well be more at risk than you think, or it could in the coming decades be that you find it's more exposed to flooding from sources which you weren't previously aware of. It's really only when we're informed of the flood risk context that we can begin to consider actually how it's best to adapt. And as we can see here, that adaptation and flood risk management will need to happen at a variety of different scales. But when we're thinking about how to manage flood risk at the property level, we need to be sure we follow the process that's set out in the Code of Practice for Property Flood Resilience. And as you can see, the very first standard and stage is the hazard assessment. And that really means identifying your specific flood risk context. To do this, there are 3 elements that we need to consider and explore. Firstly, we need to actually find out what the different sources or types of flooding are that could affect the property. We then need to actually identify and review the potential pathways and routes by which floodwater could reach the property. And lastly, we need to find out what the likelihood of flooding may be. And once this information has been collated and analysed, it can then help inform how we can adapt our property to be more flood resilient. So let's begin by looking actually at how we identify the sources of flooding. And there are, as we can see here, a variety of different ways in which flooding can occur. I mean, often when we think of flooding, we probably think of rivers as the primary sources, but it could actually be that you're in a coastal context and that the property is at risk of flooding from things like high tides, storm surges, and even long term, it could be that with sea level rise, the property is going to be more exposed to flood risk. Or it might well be that your property is in an area that has a reservoir nearby and perhaps you're at risk of flooding if there's a breach or if overtopping were to occur. But the sources of flooding can often be unexpected. And that's particularly true from flooding from something like snow or ice melt. And this can happen suddenly and at a time when it's not appeared to have actually rained very recently. Even sewer flooding can actually catch many of us off guard and leave a horrific amount of contaminants and affect people and places that may never have expected to flood. But bear in mind as well that each type of flooding can actually have different characteristics, particularly in terms of its rate of onset and the actual duration of inundation. So surface water flooding, for example, can be very intense, localised and sporadic in nature. And it might actually be that one part of a city is flooded whilst it's not even raining a couple of miles away. In contrast, if we look at something like groundwater flooding, this can build really gradually over time and actually remain and stick around for weeks or months on end. When we think about the components and elements that make up floodwater, there's a range of different factors to consider, including its depth, velocity, duration, rate of rise, time of onset, the pollution load, debris load, as well as potential wave action. And the nature of these external hazards will influence the way in which a property is impacted and what the best approach to adaptation could be. And so there are, as we've just seen, many different sources of flooding and factors that we do need to consider. And the first port of call to actually find out which types of flooding could affect your property and how exposed it may be to flood risk is to check out your national flood maps. We've put links to these in the description just below this episode, and you'll see that in each country in the UK, it has its own specific resource for this. And so in England, for example, if you want to check out what your flood risk is currently or what it's expected to be over the next 5 days, you can visit the gov.uk website at the link just here. And from there, you'd typically use the postcode or address of your premises to find out the flood risk at the location. And as you see here, it lets you know if there are flood warnings or alerts in force in the area. It shows you links to sign up for these, as well as actually providing links to view the data at measuring stations for different river levels near your area. Now that kind of short-term snapshot over 5 days is really handy. But there are also resources to help you find out the longer-term flood risk for an area. And as you can see here, there's a drop-down bar from which you can select different types of flood risk. So you could look at the potential extent, depth and flow of flooding from rivers and the seas or surface water, and potential area that could experience flooding from reservoirs. In terms of the resolution and specifics though, what it doesn't tell you is actually how likely it is that an individual property will flood, or about flood risk from sources such as blocked drains and burst pipes. In England, lead local flood authorities, which are often a unitary body or county council, are responsible for managing the risk of flooding from both ground and surface water. And more detailed information on groundwater flooding can also be accessed via the British Geological Survey, the link just below. In Wales, the Natural Resource Wales website also has a way to check flood risk by postcode, as well as details on how to sign up for flood warnings and alerts. Through the page, you can see the flood risk outlook for the next 5 days, as well as the sea and river levels near you and whether any roads are currently closed due to flooding. For more information, you can also view the Flood Risk Assessment Wales map. This has details on the flood risk from rivers, sea, surface water and reservoirs, as well as showing the location of flood defences, historic flood extents, and the flood warnings that are currently in force. And for elements relating to planning and flood risk, Wales also has a development advice map that you can see here. In Scotland, SEPA's page that we can see here will show you the long-term flood risk in an area, where to get information on managing your flood risk, actual map of the flood risk, as well as flood maps for land use planning. You can see the high, medium and low risk likelihoods of flooding from river, surface water and coastal flooding. But again, what it doesn't tell you though is actually how likely it is that an individual property will flood. In Northern Ireland, the government's flood hazard and flood risk map has a range of information that can help you find out your flood risk context. And this includes present-day data on floodplain areas, rivers and the seas, to that with climate change allowances, as well as actually looking back at some of the historic flood data that's available. And the green legend item at the bottom here will help actually explain the specifics of each data set, and the orange timeline slider allows you to see the spatial conditions of various flood events. So really I'd say the takeaway from this section where we focused on the different sources of flooding is to really remember that there are many different types of flooding, but also that each country has specific resources that can be incredibly useful in helping inform you on the types of flooding that could affect your area. Next, let's look at the second element that we want to find out, which is what the actual pathways and routes are by which floodwater could reach your property. It's important to bear in mind that you really don't have to live anywhere near a river or the sea to be at risk of flooding. You could be halfway up a hill, but still affected by flooding from overland flows. So at this point, we need to consider actually how might floodwater reach your property? What, for example, would happen if a defence failed, a culvert was blocked, barrier or channels thresholds may be overtopped or exceeded, or a sluice gate may operate incorrectly? And actually mapping out how the sources of flooding and their pathways link together and impact a property can really be a very powerful and accessible way of recording and understanding both the causes of flooding and what its consequences could be. Now, the maps and links that we've just looked at will be incredibly useful in this regard and provide a lot of clues as to the potential sources and pathways of flooding. And a lot can also be learned from local community knowledge. But do remember that no two floods are ever the same, and so it's not guaranteed that the route that floodwater took before will be the same next time. And it could well be that a car blocks the end of a street and the water is diverted to an area that's never flooded before. So we do need to be prepared for this uncertainty. And when it comes to adapting at the pathway, it might actually be that there's potential projects or schemes, might well be with natural flood management, that are underway to actually help slow the flow and reduce the volume and rate of surface water runoff. Lastly, we need to understand what the potential likelihood of flooding could be in your area. And you'll have seen in the flood maps that we looked at earlier that many of the high, medium and low risk classifications had probabilities of risk with them. And what this shows us is the annual percentage chance of flooding in a given area. But when we're looking at percentages and probabilities, we need to remember that just because a place has a 1 in 20 year chance of flooding and floods today, this doesn't mean it won't happen for another 19 years. And as you can see illustrated here with this 20-sided dice, each time we roll it, there's going to be that same 1 in 20 probability of the result being we will flood. In England, as we can see here, flood maps have flood zones, which are used to denote probabilities and severities of flood risk and link into planning and development policies. Flood Zone 1 is the lowest probability of flooding and is shown as clear or transparent on the map. It defines land assessed as having less than a 1 in 1,000 annual probability of river or sea flooding. Flood Zone 2 is medium probability and shown as light blue. This denotes land assessed as having between 1 in 100 and 1 in 1,000 annual probability of river flooding, or between 1 in 200 and 1 in 1,000 annual probability of flooding from the sea. Now, flood zone 3 is shown in dark blue. And what's crucial to note here is that flood zone 3 is split into 3A and 3B. 3A is used to denote land that's been assessed as having a 1 in 100 or greater annual probability of river flooding, or a 1 in 200 or greater annual probability of sea flooding. And lastly, we have flood zone 3B, and known as the functional floodplain. And this is used to define land where water would normally flow or be stored during a flood event. Now, an important aspect to bear in mind is that not all types of flood risk will be shown on flood maps. You'll find there's often more detailed or advanced flood risk information available if you inquire with your local authority and relevant government agencies. In England, for example, the Environment Agency have Product 4, which can actually help provide more comprehensive information on things like river levels, extents, and flow rates, as well as historic flood event outlines. There's also detailed flood risk assessment maps and actually key flood datums that include climate change allowances. And there are also tools that can actually help us understand the spatial implication of future climate change data sets for 2030, 50 and 80. And these can be incredibly helpful in actually helping us plan ahead and make sure that our properties and communities are more future-proof. It could also be that you commission consultants to undertake more detailed flood risk modelling and assessments on that area. They'd also look at the information from those recorded flood outlines and future flood assessments. And if need be, modelling could be undertaken, and this can range from anything like a simple desktop study to a full hydrodynamic complex method. In terms of next steps, once you've found out your flood risk context, whatever response is taken, it does need to be site-specific. It could be that there's interventions that can be made along the pathway to actually reduce the risk at your property and to the surrounding area. But when it comes to adaptation at that property level, as I mentioned earlier, it's really important that we follow the process that's set out in the Code of Practice for Property Flood Resilience. And as you can see here, that hazard assessment is really the first stage in that process. And after that, the property setup is reviewed with the survey, and that really makes sure that any design options can be contextually appropriate and suit the people, the property, and the place. Now, in terms of short-term actions that you can take right now, you can sign up very easily and quickly for flood warnings. And these can help keep us informed on the severity of an event and actually when to prepare, when to take action, and how to help us avoid danger to life. Now, another way of staying informed on the levels of flood warning that are enforced for a given area, or to report back any flood conditions that you've seen, is to register with or call Floodline at the number that we've shown just here. It can also be good practice to sign up for weather warnings via the Met Office's website. And there are a range of platforms that can give regular updates on river gauge levels throughout the UK. And monitoring these and having that live feedback is crucial and can actually help inform both how and when you act and adapt. There can also be local flood groups that will be able to help direct you to information that's specific to your particular context. Fundamentally though, if you can find out what the sources of flooding are, identify the pathways and routes by which that floodwater could reach your property and the potential likelihood of a flood event, then you really will be very well informed on your flood risk context. Now, if any of this seems a little bit technical, then don't be worried, because there are many experts out there in the industry that can help you and guide you through the process of understanding your flood risk context. But first and foremost, do check out the links that we've put in the description below this video and search your national flood maps, as well as signing up for flood warnings and Floodline, because these will very quickly give you a detailed understanding of your specific flood risk context. And remember that this isn't just harmless muddy water, it can contain some really dangerous contaminants, and as you can see here, we've covered this in our episode on what makes up floodwater. And the key thing here is not just to bury our heads in the sand and hope that the water will never come. It's much better to take a proactive approach and to be aware and informed of what the flood risk could be, and that will then allow us to be in a really good position to actually work out how we need to act and adapt. So thanks very much for listening, and if you'd like to keep updated on future episodes, then please subscribe below, hit the bell for notifications, and we look forward to seeing you soon.